On the morning of April 12, 1972, the water in the port of New Bedford was smooth as dirty glass, and a low fog hid the buoys and erased the lines on the far side of the channel. As so often happened on the south coast of Massachusetts when cold Atlantic air met the uneven warming of early spring. At 186 Union Street, the glass door of the Star of the Sea bakery had already been unlocked before 6. As always, the fluorescent lights were on, and the smell of yeast and coffee was beginning to fill the space. Even so, that morning the street seemed bigger and emptier, with fewer hurried footsteps and fewer engines stopping in second gear. The doorbell rang only twice in the first hour, and neither time was it sailors looking for strong coffee and sweet bread to take on the way. They were men from the block in rubber boots who came in slowly, their pant legs still damp from work on the docks or in warehouse basements. They looked at the counter and then looked at the folded newspaper under an arm, as if the news might be written on the display glass as well. The damp, early spring cold slipped in under the door and made the wooden floorboards crack, and what was at stake was simple and immediate. Without the military routine that filled pockets and quickened steps, Star of the Sea might not make it to the end of the month, and the family that depended on it would have to decide quickly whether to change what it sold or change cities. Behind the counter, Emília and Furtado kept her hands busy with the same gesture as always: damp cloth, display cases, crumbs, because stopping to read was to give thought room to take over, and because cleaning was also a way of holding on to the place's dignity when business failed. The small radio, set beside the cash register, repeated the same phrase since the night before, between traffic bulletins and local ads: reduction of activities at Naval Air Station South Weymouth, cuts, redistribution, shutdown of services. The voice was dry, from an announcer used to saying things that changed lives without asking permission, with a cadence of official news and administrative terms that seemed neutral until they hit a shop's cash drawer. The bakery had been opened to serve uniforms in haste, with hours shaped by shifts and commutes, and with products meant to be carried in the hand, wrapped quickly. Now the question was not abstract and could not wait. Without the base, without sailors, was the bakery still a bakery, or did it become a memory? The answer had a deadline, because the building's rent came due at the end of May, and the gas oven, bought used and paid in installments, was not yet paid off, with payments that did not wait for good intentions. Emília did not say this out loud, but her body knew. The weight of the next month was already on her shoulders before the coffee cooled, and the routine of opening early left less room for error when the margin was thin. Her husband, Joaquim, was in the back, in the oven's heat, baking trays of dough he himself had kneaded at 3:30 in the morning, at the hour when the city was still dark and delivery trucks began to circulate. The smell of fresh-baked bread was still the same, and that made everything else feel more unjust. The wort had the same hardness, and the result had the same quality, but the world around them no longer guaranteed a return. Their oldest son, Paolo, 17, helped before technical school, a white T-shirt under his apron, hair sticking to his forehead from the steam and heat that escaped when the oven door opened. He stacked rings and cream pastries in silence, unwillingly hearing the talk that came from the street between one car parking and another passing. The Weymouth people are leaving, they're transferring to Norfolk. It's really closing. Phrases said like someone repeating what they heard on the radio or read in the paper, with no way to confirm and no way to stop it. Star of the Sea Bakery was far from Weymouth, and even so the news crossed the state like cold wind, because federal decisions and cuts to military installations had a chain effect, hitting suppliers, civilian jobs, and consumption. New Bedford was not a big naval-based town. It was a fishing port town, a town of warehouses and factories that had seen better days, with neighborhoods marked by immigration and heavy labor, and with an economy that rose and fell with the catch, the price of fuel, and the pace of industry. But the bakery had lived since 1966 on a current of people coming and going. Sailors passing through, civilian employees, truckers hauling loads to Quincy and Boston, people who liked the simple comfort of hot bread with butter and coffee, served without delay. Emília and Joaquim had arrived from Ponta Delgada in the Azores and had learned quickly that men in uniform paid cash, did not argue about price, and came back if service was fast in a time when cash still ruled the counter and the cash register drawer had to have a right change. They had built the menu the way one builds a net. Cornbread, cream-filled puff pastries, codfish fritters on Fridays, and, for Americans, plain donuts and slices of chocolate cake. Things that fit local habits and what ingredients allowed. That morning, the newspaper, the Standard Times, stayed open on the counter only a short time, with the headline and columns of numbers and official statements taking up too much space for a small place. Emília pushed it under the register, as if hiding the headline could lessen reality or at least delay the moment when it would become a decision. She looked out the window and saw the fog lifting slowly, revealing the port's movement. An ice truck, a man pushing a fish cart covered with a tarp, an old car with a failing exhaust. The world went on, but the kind of people who sustained the bakery seemed to have been cut off from the future, as if part of the flow had been diverted without warning. At 7:20, the first man came in who still carried something of the Navy. A corporal in a blue jacket, not in full uniform, with a canvas bag. He stopped in front of the display, took a deep breath, and ordered 2 coffees and 4 sweet rolls. Emília served carefully, measuring the coffee as always and putting the rolls in a paper bag. And when he held out the bill, she saw the slight tremor in his hand, a tremor that was not only from the cold. "Is it really going to close?" he asked, without looking straight at them. Joaquim appeared from the back, wiping his hands on his apron. His voice was low, with the accent that never went away, even after years at the counter and taking orders in English. "They say yes." The man nodded, as if he had already accepted it, and left with the bag hanging from his arm. The doorbell rang and kept echoing a little longer than usual, because the bakery was empty and the sound was not muffled by talk and movement. Emília looked at her husband. The two did not argue in front of their son, but it was no secret that the bills had been tight since winter, when business usually drops and the cost of heat and supplies weighs more. The price of flour had gone up, gas had increased, and competition from grocery stores with industrial bread was coming on strong, with shelves full of standardized packaging and prices a small oven had trouble matching. Even so, the bakery was theirs, the smell was theirs, the rhythm was theirs. Changing cities meant starting over with less youth in the body and more weight in the chest, and it also meant facing new rent, new customers, and new rules with no guarantee. Staying mid insisting on a math that was already beginning not to add up. At the end of that afternoon, when they locked the door and pulled down the grate, Emília walked with Paolo to the corner of Purchase Street to catch the bus, in a line system that served downtown and the neighborhoods on schedules that did not always match retail work. The wind came off the sea with salt and diesel, mixing the smell of docks and traffic. In the appliance store window, a television showed images of helicopters in Vietnam, without sound, only captions, as was common in storefronts that kept the volume low so as not to bother the street. Paolo stopped for a second to look, as many boys did. Emília did not pull him away. She only put her hand on his shoulder, firm, as if to say his body was still there and needed to stay there, despite what the television showed and what the recruitment posters still promised. At home, on the second floor of an old building near downtown, their youngest daughter, Lucia, 9, did her homework at the kitchen table while Joaquim counted the day's bills. The money was little, and the silence was large, the kind of silence that appears when you hear the clock and the building's plumbing more than conversation. His pen wrote amounts in a black-covered notebook: flour, milk, sugar, rent, oven installment, electricity, with numbers that had to close because the supplier and the landlord did not accept explanations. Emília washed the baking trays with hot water, and the steam rose as if the kitchen were a small ship, smelling of detergent and oven grease soaked in. On the night of April 18th, a letter arrived, on thicker paper in an official envelope. It was not from Weymouth. It was from a New Bedford real estate office, warning that as of June the rent would rise in accordance with market conditions, a formula that sounded impersonal and, for that very reason, hard to contest. Joaquim read it twice and set the letter on the table, aligned with the edge, as if order could make the news less aggressive. Emília sat and looked at the account notebook, where the increase was not a sentence. It was one more line in an already tight month. Paolo, already tall with broad shoulders, came into the kitchen with his technical school uniform wrinkled, smelling of shop and hallway. He had heard enough in the corridors to know many fathers were losing jobs, and that talk of cuts and transfers did not stay only on the radio. He spoke with the urgency of someone trying to offer a solution before the problem became despair. We can sell more to people here. Make sandwiches lunch. There are people at the Acushnet factory. There are people at the port. Joaquim did not answer right away. He had the calm of someone who had already seen change turn into loss, and he knew that expanding the offering also meant increasing cost and risk. Emília looked at her son with a mix of pride and fear. Pride that he was thinking, fear that he believed everything could be solved with extra work, as if effort alone could replace customers who were disappearing. On Sunday, April 23rd, after Mass at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church on County Street, Emília stayed on the steps, talking with other women, in a moment when the community gathered and traded practical information. Their English had the same broken rhythm, mixed with Portuguese words, and the subject went back and forth between what could be understood from the newspaper and what could be seen in the pocket. They talked about the closure, they talked about their children, they talked about the price of meat which weighed on the budget when wages did not keep up. One woman said her husband was thinking of going to Fall River to work construction. Another spoke of a cousin in Newark, New Jersey, who had an opening in a larger bakery. No one spoke of dreams. They spoke of survival, rent, work, school. Emília walked back home with Joaquim and the children. The sky was clear, but the wind cut, and April light did not warm the way it looked. On the corner, a recruitment poster was already faded by rain, its edges lifting. Paolo glanced at it quickly, as if the poster were calling him by name. Joaquim noticed, and his jaw tightened, a brief gesture that said more than any sentence. The following week, the bakery tried a small adjustment because sometimes that is how it begins, not with a total turn, but with a controlled bet to see if the neighborhood responds. Emília made a pot of white bean soup with sausage, the way she learned from her mother, using what she could buy without blowing up the notebook, and put up a hand-lettered sign. Hot soup. 35 cents. Joaquim made longer bread, baguette style, adapting the dough and oven time to what the equipment allowed, and Paolo assembled ham and cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, like you saw at lunch counters. The smell drew people from the port, and for a few days it seemed the world could be persuaded to stay, with business that filled the drawer with coins and small bills. But the city carried a tiredness that was not only that family's. In May, the news about Naval Air Station South Weymouth continued, with dates and numbers, and with the repetition that makes a decision seem inevitable. The radio said the last attachments would be transferred over the summer. The word shutdown began to appear naturally, as if it were routine. In New Bedford, men who used to spend without thinking began to count coins. Tips shrank. Coffee was ordered in a smaller cup, and the order came with the silent question of price, as if every cent had to be justified. On May 5th, 1972, a Friday under a low sky, Paolo came back early from technical school with the expression of someone who had heard something too big for his age. He came in through the back door, past the flour sack and the milk crate, and stopped near the oven, where Joaquim was pulling out a tray with thick gloves, his face marked by heat. The shop said there'll be fewer apprentice slots. They cut things in Quincy, and people say it's going to get worse in the summer. He was not talking about a distant future. He was talking about the next month, the kind of talk that changes how someone looks at their own street. Emília, at the counter, heard and felt a tightening, not from surprise, but from confirmation that the walls were closing in. That same day, later, the black rotary phone rang, not to bring tragedy, but to bring a difficult proposal. It was a supplier from the Brockton area offering cheaper flour, as long as Joaquim bought in volume and paid cash, a common condition when the supplier wanted to reduce risk and guarantee turnover. Joaquim thanked him and refused politely. Buying in volume was tying up money that no longer remained, and paying cash was taking from rent and electricity. The following weeks came with the sound of smaller cash registers. In June, the rent rose as the letter had promised, and the increase entered the notebook as a line that could not be erased. Joaquim went to the bank on Pleasant Street to ask for an extension on the oven loan. He came back with a closed face. The manager spoke politely, but with the coldness of someone with no obligation to bet on the future, asking for guarantees and looking at numbers as if they were destiny. The bank did not take bread out of the oven, but it took air out of the chest. Emília began to record everything more rigorously, as if exact numbers could tame fear. She reduced batches on weekdays, reused paper, fixed a shelf with bent nails instead of buying another, and began to measure waste, as if every crumb had value. Lucia, small and serious, started folding napkins and lining up spoons in the jar, as if she were an employee, imitating what she saw to help without being asked. Donna Celeste, the neighbor in the same building, sometimes appeared with a pot of rice or a sack of potatoes, simple things that avoided a trip to the market, and that, in that kind of household economy, meant a week that could be breathed through. The South Weymouth base, even far away, kept emptying. On the radio, they announced dates: July, August, final transfer. Emília began to recognize the pattern. When a big institution closes, it is not only closed doors, it closes habits, it closes routes, it closes consumption. The bakery felt it in the till. The lunch sandwich sold, but not the way a sailor's breakfast sold. The soup was praised, but praise did not turn into enough money, and praise did not pay an installment. In July, the heat arrived with that humid weight that made the city smell stronger. Fish, diesel, old dockwood, garbage warmed in the sun, and the still air that came in through the open door. On July 9th, 1972, Emília went to the house of a distant cousin in Fall River to ask about work and rent. She took Route 195, passing through Dartmouth and crossing the bridge, on a trip many people made to look for opportunity in nearby cities when jobs tightened. Fall River had dark brick buildings and the same air of a city that had once had more industry, with blocks marked by old mills and neighborhood commerce. Her cousin lived in a small apartment near South Main Street and said a pastry shop was looking for counter help, but the pay was low and the hours were bad, with long shifts and little flexibility. She also spoke of a bakery for sale in Providence, Rhode Island, where the Portuguese community was large. The name Providence stayed in Emília's head like a word that promised and threatened at the same time, because it meant starting over in cost, and because every promise at that moment came with a bill. When she returned, Joaquim was sitting on the sofa with Paolo, who had his technical school notebooks open on his lap. The television was on without sound, as if it were only light and image to fill the room. Paolo looked at his mother with an effort to seem useful, and he was useful in a way his body did not need to prove. He did the math, wrote lists, looked at job ads, compared rent prices and newspaper clippings, trying to turn uncertainty into a table. He hated the feeling of being at the mercy of other people's decisions, and because of that, tried to occupy the space with work. On August 2nd, a clear Wednesday, Joaquim went to the port early to buy fish to make fritters and try to draw customers on Friday. He walked through the warehouse zone with the smell of salt and fish blood in the air and saw a group of men discussing work, hands in pockets and bodies leaning in like people talking about something serious. One of them had been laid off from a Navy Link service in Quincy. Another talked about going to Connecticut. Joaquim returned to the bakery with a bag of fish, and a decision almost formed. Either they changed the menu until it became something else, or they changed cities before the city pushed them, before rent and credit closed the door on them. The decision, however, was not only economic. It was also about identity. The bakery was the place where Emília spoke Portuguese without apologizing, where Joaquim knew customers by name, where Paulo had grown up behind the counter, learning to measure, wrap, and make change. Changing cities meant losing the network of neighbors, the church, the faces that helped without asking. But staying meant watching the till shrink month after month and seeing Paulo face a short horizon, with technical school training people for a market that was narrowing, with fewer openings and more competition. At the end of August, on a night when the air already carried a promise of autumn, Emília and Joaquim sat in the kitchen after Lucia fell asleep. The window was open, and the distant sound of a train crossed the city, mixed with the noise of fewer cars. On the table were three things: the account notebook, the rent letter, and a flyer for a bakery for sale in Providence, in the Fox Point area, near Wickenden Street. The flyer had a black and white photo of a simple storefront and said, "Near the Portuguese community," a phrase that worked as an argument and as an informal guarantee of customers. Joaquim spoke first in a low voice. "Providence has more people. There's students, there's a hospital, there's commerce." Emília looked at his hands, burned and marked with flour, with small scars from oven and knife. She knew he was tired, and she also knew the closure in Weymouth had changed the family's clock. They could not wait for the world to improve on its own, because rent and the bank did not wait. Paulo, listening from the living room, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a sheet of notebook paper in his hand, where he had written down prices and bus schedules, like someone already trying to fit logistics into the budget. "We could do delivery. We can make bread for a grocery. We can't just stand still." None of them used the word fear, but it was present, filling the air like smoke, showing up in small gestures, in the way they looked at the notebook and the letter, as if each paper were also a deadline. In September 1972, the leaves began to yellow on the trees along County Street, and the sea wind grew sharper. The bakery kept operating, but Emília was already selling things to raise money: an old mixer, an extra table, metal boxes, items that had been bought for a volume that no longer existed. Joaquim put a discreet notice on the door: "Equipment for sale." Some customers asked, and Emília answered with a small smile, saying it was an adjustment. The word "close" was said only at home, as if speaking it in public would give final shape to what still hurt. On September 14th, Joaquim went to Providence by bus to see the advertised location. He got off at Kennedy Plaza and walked to Fox Point, passing old houses and small shops, in a neighborhood where foot traffic was steadier than on streets that depended on cars. The bakery for sale sat on a corner with a narrow sidewalk. The owner was an old Italian man, tired, who wanted to retire. The oven was smaller, but it worked. The rent was high, but there was constant foot traffic, students going up and down College Hill, hospital workers, neighborhood families. Joaquim came back with the smell of a bigger city on his coat and an expression that mixed hope with caution, like someone who sees opportunity and, at the same time, already begins to count the risk. In early October, the decision was made with the same sobriety with which bread is baked, without speeches, with action. They would sell-star the sea as best they could, pay what was possible, and reopen in Providence with a broader, more American menu, without abandoning what was theirs. The move was not an escape. It was work at another address, with the same discipline and a different street. The point of no return came on an ordinary morning, and for that very reason, it stayed marked. On October 11th, 1972, the supplier's truck stopped on Union Street with fewer sacks than the order. The driver, a man with a cigarette stuck at the corner of his mouth, explained that the company was going to reduce deliveries to small businesses and prioritize larger contracts in Boston and Quincy, a decision of route and margin that did not take counter-survival into account. Joaquim signed the receipt with tight handwriting, and when he closed the truck door, he stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling that even the basics, flour, routine, predictability, were beginning to depend on distant decisions. That same day, he pulled from his pocket a folded paper with a Fox Point Italian man's phone number and called from a pay phone near Purchase Street, with coins that clinked as if they were too few. The answer came simply. The location was still available, but not for long. The last bake in New Bedford happened on October 28, 1972, a Saturday with a clear, cold sky, the light already lower in the air dryer. Emília woke before 4, as always, and for the first time in years she did not feel urgency, but a quiet sadness, as if her body knew it was repeating a gesture for the last time in that place. Joaquim lit the oven carefully, as if the machine were an animal that deserved respect, and waited for it to heat with the attention of someone who knows the equipment's sound and smell. Lucia helped put labels on the paper bags. Paolo sat on a chair near the counter, wrapping loaves with quick, contained movements, as if each fold of wax paper were a way of keeping the place. Customers came more than on ordinary days, as if the news had traveled through church, port, and neighborhood. An old fisherman brought a bag of apples as a gift. A woman from church left an envelope with money and did not want change. A man who worked at the port held Joaquim's hand longer than usual. No one made a speech. It was a farewell without ceremony, the way things that hold up daily life say goodbye, with practical gestures and lowered eyes. At the end of the afternoon, when the last tray came out of the oven, the smell of hot bread stayed trapped in the walls, mixed with the old smell of coffee and burnt sugar. Emília wiped the counter one last time. Joaquim turned off the lights one by one. Paolo looked at the empty display case, as if trying to memorize his own reflection there, the boy he had been behind that glass. Lucia held her mother's hand tightly and did not cry. She only squeezed, as she had seen her mother do on hard days, as if the squeeze were a way to keep the ground firm. The move to Providence happened in the first week of November, with a rented truck and cardboard boxes labeled in marker, sugar, pans, plates. Route 195 was dry, and the sky had that hard blue of a New England autumn that promises no warmth. Emília looked out the truck window and watched the signs change, the exits, the city names. It was like crossing an invisible border, with the same language and another practical life. Providence had more noise, more people, more hurry. Fox Point smelled of bread from other bakeries, of coffee, of gasoline, and the street had a flow that did not depend only on the port. The new location had worn flooring and stained walls, but morning light came in well through the window. Joaquim spent days adjusting the oven, learning the right timing, testing temperature and dough point so as not to lose product. Emília reorganized the counter, set out a small vase with artificial flowers, hung a new calendar. Paolo helped as he could, writing down orders, answering the phone, walking to the corner grocery to buy paper and twine. His work changed shape. Less strength, more thinking, more conversation with suppliers, more arithmetic done on wrapping paper when there was no notebook, with the attention of someone who knows a small mistake becomes a big lack. In December 1972, the Providence Bakery already had regular customers, students who bought coffee and a donut, nurses who took a wrapped sandwich, Portuguese families who came for cornbread for Christmas Eve supper. Emília began making apple pie too, because she learned that was what sold well there, and because the counter needed to speak the neighborhood's language without losing its own. Joaquim kept making codfish fritters on Fridays, and the smell drew people who did not speak Portuguese, but recognized good food. Lucia, after school, sat on a stool behind the counter with a book, lifting her eyes when the bell rang, already used to the rhythm of a new street, with different footsteps and different hours. On Christmas Eve, snow fell lightly, without a storm, covering the sidewalks of Wickenden Street with a thin layer that reflected the shop lights. The bakery closed earlier. Emília turned off the lights and checked the lock twice, out of habit, as if the gesture ensured what they had built there would not slip away during the night. Outside, cars and people still passed on their way to dinners, and the street did not feel like a street in farewell. It felt like a street in operation, with lit windows and steady steps. At home, in the small rented apartment above a shop, Lucia fell asleep early with a book on her lap. Paolo stayed near the window, watching snow settle on wires and car hoods. Joaquim opened a bottle of simple wine and cut slices of bread left over from the day. Emília sat for a few minutes without getting up to wash anything, as if she had decided that night counted as work done too, and as if the short rest were part of what kept the family standing. When Paolo mentioned that a classmate from technical school had an uncle who found maintenance side jobs near the hospital, Joaquim did not answer with caution. He answered with a nod, like someone already ready to say yes to a good thing before it passed, because now yes was also strategy. New Bedford was kept in boxes that did not need to be opened to exist. A photo of the old bakery's facade, a dish towel with faded embroidery, a yellowed receipt for the first sack of flour bought in 1966. The door on Union Street had been closed, and that would not be undone, and the old oven had been left for another owner. Even so, the move had not become a dismantling. The family had arrived intact, and for them, that was a kind of relief that did not need to be announced, only live the next day. On December 30th, 1972, Emília arrived early at the Providence Bakery and unlocked the door. The bell rang, and she turned on the coffee maker before even taking off her coat, letting the smell fill the space as a sign of opening. Joaquim came soon after, with flour in a paper sack and the newspaper under his arm. Paolo showed up carrying a box of cups and announced, with the objectivity of someone trying to grow at the right pace, that a grocery on Ive Street would agree to test 20 cornbreads per week, paid on time, if delivery was made on Monday mornings. Emília did not celebrate with big words. She took a pencil, wrote the order on a paper held by a magnet on the small refrigerator, and adjusted the oven schedule. Shortly after 7, the first customer came in, a nurse in a white uniform, asking for coffee and a wrapped sandwich to eat on break. Next came 2 students, hair still damp from the cold, laughing softly about something from the night before, and they took donuts and a slice of apple pie to share. The morning went on with a short, real line, and with enough money that the drawer did not run out of change. Before noon, Joaquim checked the till, put the bills in order, and set aside the amount for rent and the week's bills, the way he had always wanted to do without strain. At the end of the shift, Paolo swept the floor, Lucia gathered the napkins as she already did, and Emília closed the door without hurry. There was work for the next day, and there was also the simple feeling that the choices had worked, that each person there had a clear place in that new routine, and that for now, that was enough. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.